Welcome back, everyone. I'm Pena from the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, Barbados. The blue economy is emerging globally as a powerful and persuasive new concept for sustainable development based on economic activities associated with the ocean. But what is the blue economy, and to whom will it bring benefits? What are the key issues which women within blue economies in the global south are mobilizing and prioritizing to advance women? Mereoni Chung, Associate with Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DAWN, leads this cross-regional dialogue on feminist perspectives on the blue economy. This panel is a cross-regional dialogue with feminist perspectives on the blue economy from SIDS in the Pacific and the Caribbean regions to share robust discussions that lead to more critical engagement with actors who have vested interest in our ocean and its resources. Mereoni, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Greetings and welcome to this cross-regional dialogue between the Pacific and the Caribbean, titled Feeling Blue, Pacific Feminist Perspectives on the Blue Economy. I am Mereoni and I am from Fiji, and I am joined here today navigating this topic on the blue economy with two speakers from the Global South. Emeline, Siale, Ilolahia, and Beverley Wade. Siale Ilolahia is from the Pacific Island Kingdom of Tonga and is the Executive Director of the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, PIANGO. Our colleague, Beverley Wade, is from Belize in the Caribbean and is the Director of Fisheries from the Belize Fisheries Department. I welcome you both and thank you very much for joining us today in this dialogue. So, this blue economy has been gaining traction in development discourse since 2012, since the 2012 Rio Plus 20 entry onto the global stage at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development. We have steadily observed the rise of the blue economy agenda in regional and national policy spaces, shaping development dialogues, capturing island storytelling and ocean identities, and determining new and old relationships across the political and economic global south. The blue economy provides a platform for small island developing states, SIDS, to have a larger presence in the sustainable development aspirations and commitments being driven at the global level by state and non-state actors. So, Siale and Beverley, what is the blue economy that we are navigating? Can you share with us what is the blue economy in your regions? How is it being defined? And what kinds of developments are being promoted as blue economy? Siale, if I could start with you, and we could share with Beverley.
Thank you, Mereoni. And in addition to the background that you have provided, my sharing today is also influenced in the thinking by the work that has been done as a collective by the Pacific Regional NGOs Alliance, which is a couple of regional civil society coming together, the Pacific Conference of Churches, the Pacific Disability Forum, the Youth Council. We also have the Women Pact for, the Pacific Network for Globalization, WWF, and us as well. But we also engage with DAWN, Oxfam, Pacific, and others. So this is a collective perspective. But at the same time, I think for PIANGO, we had been engaging a lot in the dialogue and making sure that there are civil society Pacific voices in the sustainable development agenda since 2015. In the development of the SDG Agenda 2030. And we have seen a lot of things that has developed from the UN And I think this is one of the things that we had recognized where the Blue agenda has come about. But it's quite a concern because we had seen that become an agenda that very disconnected. Yeah, it's the conversation is happening in New York, and what we have seen, the players that are now coming into the space, financial institutions are even part of the framing of what blue economy is. We also start to see, in the agenda to 2030. The recognitions of blended financing, for example, where it's no longer government taking the lead in financing our development, but they're looking at private sector. Whereas in our region, the players as private sectors are just very small scale businesses. So the players are really from outside. So you see the corporate businesses are part and parcel of making decisions for our development in the Pacific. And I think this is where the concerns from civil society that the blue economy has become, an agenda that had been decided or being framed, influenced from outside. But then the narrative of that is framing our policy directions from our region. And we all know that majority of our women at the community, not just women, youth, disability, and all the other minority groups are not part and parcel of that conversation. So it's critical as well, because we also start to see that the language and the narrative that they're using are bringing in our cultural values, are bringing in, and it become like a big blanket that is covered, the whole idea and the whole ideology of a blue economy, that oftentimes we really feel like that if we contest it, it's like that we're the old, Why are you contesting something that really speak to our culture, speak to our identity? Our ocean is our identity. So it's really make the space shrinking, but not just shrinking, but it's make it so hard for you to participate and provide your critical view. And so our PIANGO Alliance has really come up with the idea, let's develop a framework, because we don't really know the content of what should be our blue economy, but let's contest it. Let's put a critical view around what's coming up and what we understand of how this has been a foreign ideology that has been pushed in to frame a lot of our, and a lot of our policies are either being developed by consultants from outside or being, copy and paste from somewhere. So it's really, and the disconnections in consultation, even our national policies, it really speaks volume to why we need to articulate more in terms of what does it mean. So blue economy for us is really about our ocean, and how does the ocean is related to our land and our whole ecosystem as people. It's not different. It's not separated. But what the narratives current stand now is that it's a commodity. It's like that we are trying to put value into those ecosystem that has been our resilience for years. And so this is where the unbalance, that we need to start looking at. And I'm really happy for this conversation, because, we all know how the role of women is really critical in where we are now, and even more so in this current situation, where we really need to take this as a critical juncture and reflect on what's happening in our development landscape. And I'll leave it there, Mereoni.
Thank you, Siale. Beverley, would you like to share your views from the Caribbean on what is the blue economy in your region?
Sure, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank my colleague from the Tonga for an excellent segue. into the thinking behind blue economy in the Pacific. So as mentioned earlier in the introduction, the blue economy is this new and emerging thinking that is centered around our oceans and our activities that are around our oceans. The small island developing state, Belize, is also very much cognizant of the role that the blue economy plays in our national economy and our development, and the Caribbean as a whole. Blue economy is not new to us. As my colleague from Tonga mentioned earlier, we have been having development in this blue space for quite some time. But there's a repackaging now of those activities, and there is a repackaging, and as my colleague from Tonga mentioned, it's important for us now to have an input into that repackaging to ensure that the development of those blue assets and blue resources are really done in a way that benefits us as a people and our economic development. And so at the regional level, there's been a movement in the Caribbean to now work with countries to develop that very framework that was mentioned earlier by Emeline, to ensure that there is a framework which then defines what blue economy for us is or should be. And so I am very excited in Belize because we've recently had a change of government in November of last year, and they've created for the first time the Ministry of Blue Economy. And so we are now entering, I believe, some very exciting and pioneering times for Belize, where we're now putting together the framework for our national blue economy. What is important for us is that we want to have a blue economy sector that is productive, it's resilient, and it's vibrant, contributing substantially to the socioeconomic well-being of our country and its people. And so it is now treated as one of the key economic pillars in our national economic approach for Belize, and also for our recovery plan. COVID-19 pandemic has really devastated the national economies globally. And for us as small island developing states, it has really, really significantly negatively impacted us. When you look at the sectors of tourism and fisheries alone, they contribute 40% to our national GDP, and COVID-19 basically brought that down almost to zero. And so the blue economy is also being looked as one of those key pillars that is expected to play a very important role in our national recovery, one, and also to play a role in our national development. Actually, our mission for our blue economy now in Belize is to increase our gross domestic product through a thriving blue economy development pathway that is harmonized, it's innovative, and socially just. And we expect that this would be supported by a robust science-based management regime for our blue resources. And as I mentioned before, a space that would improve the livelihood of all Belizeans. And so we are now looking at, by the end of this year, to actually have a blue economy strategy and plan in place for Belize, where we have clearly identified key sectors that we intend to look at for economic development, but at the same time that we would have identified those strategic pathways to ensure that the environmental safeguards are very much mainstreamed into this planning process and into this framework, and also the social safeguards. And that is where we're very keen on also having a discussion with regards to gender in the blue economy, because we have to ensure that we would have in these plans the necessary mechanisms necessary reference and the necessary systems to allow for all people to be able to have the kind of access to the blue resources, but at the same time that they may be afforded an opportunity to also be a part of the decision making in processes and governance as it speaks to blue economy. So blue economy, as mentioned by my colleague from Tonga, is very important for us. It defines us from a development standpoint. It defines us from a social standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. And it's important that as we go about putting this framework together, that we do it in such a way that is as inclusive and as cognizant as possible of the key areas that we need to ensure that we don't see the kind of marginalization that can happen if you do not have a well-planned approach and a framework in place which speaks to, at the end of the day, capitalizing on the economic and development potential of your blue assets at the end of the day, and also ensuring, as I said, that the necessary safeguards and mechanisms are in place for participation, inclusion, and benefits across the board.
Thank you, Beverley, for that insight. And I can see already, some junction in the regional approaches to an intention to have a critical strategic framework on the blue economy that comes from us, that comes from your region, that guides how you navigate this development agenda. And Beverley, you highlighted, two key sectors in the blue economy agenda that are the sustainable sectors of, sustainable fisheries, sustainable tourism, and in the Pacific, there's shared priorities around those sectors. The blue economy is other sectors as well, shipping, bioprospecting, and other elements. And I just wanted to ask if you could both share views on what are the if you think about the implications, you've raised so many concerns as well as the strategic opportunities of this agenda. What are the long-term implications that the blue economy could have for the Pacific and the Caribbean people and their resources? If you'd like to reflect on that and share.
Sure. So you rightfully mentioned the blue economy is now a multi-sectorial, multi-stakeholder space that we're working in. It's a space which also there's a lot of cross-cutting considerations such as climate change, also such as different aspects, gender and the financial sector, the private sector, and so it is a space which require much coordination. It's a space which requires that you have mechanisms in place to ensure that you have participation and inclusion at all of these levels. One of the things that we did in Belize, from the very onset, we created a blue economic cluster. And that cluster is a body that is actually chaired at the highest level in government. It's chaired by the CEO in the Ministry of the Blue Economy. And it sits on that cluster high-level officials in the government from key ministries such as finance, economic development, tourism, sustainable development. But it also sits on that sector along with these people, the private sector, the NGO, civil society, academia. So it is already recognized that this is a very complex space that we're working in. And it is a space which requires a dedicated commitment to put in the mechanisms that will promote that kind of coordination and that kind of input from all levels. The input there has to be the kind of vertical communication in developing the blue economy. Otherwise, you run the risk now of having increased disparity between the income gaps between various vulnerable groups that are trying to participate in the blue economy. And so that is really one of the considerations that we do have. Like any new and emerging sector, there's much energy behind it, but we have to ensure that the approach is a people-centered approach, that the approach is also an approach to ensure that you don't create further disparity and these gaps as it relates to livelihoods, as it relates to income, and as it relates to participation. The other thing I will tell you is that the blue economy, as the name connotes blue, it's very much dependent on the functional integrity and health of your blue assets. And so when you have private sector and you have development coming in with much enthusiasm, which we encourage, what we are also encouraged is very much guided investments that speaks to responsible development, investments that speaks to the sustainable use of the resources. And so it is those two pillars are very important for us when we look at our blue economy: social protection and environmental protection. Because if you don't have your blue assets, then you would have really we would have shot yourself in your foot, because it's those very blue assets that you are very much now developing and investing for a blue economy around. And so it is very important that those things are prominent, very prominent in every aspect of your blue economy framework. And so a big part of our engagement is to look at capacity that is required to ensure responsible development of our blue assets, to look at capacity at community level and NGO level, who play a very important role in safeguarding our blue assets, and also to look at that engagement with the private sector to say, if you want to invest in a blue economy in Belize or in the region, this is the type of investment that we're looking at, and these are the guidelines that we are now putting in place. So I think those things are very important at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverley. And that's a great segue into getting comments from Siale on the mechanisms within the Pacific that engage, allow the Pacific Islanders, the people, and our governments to engage the blue economy agenda, whether it's through participation, the role of the private sector, but also, as Beverley mentioned, about being involved in the decision making, being involved in protecting the integrity of the ocean and so forth. So Siale, from the Pacific, your Pacific perspective, what has been your experiences around the mechanisms of the blue economy agenda?
Thank you, Mereoni. I think for the blue economy mechanisms in the Pacific, I would say that we are still far behind. And I speak to this in relations to government and our other intergovernmental agencies in the Pacific. Those political spaces, for example, have very limited structured mechanisms of engaging with civil society. So that there is a space for the multi-stakeholder that Beverley has been talking about. It seems like that there seems to be far ahead of us in terms of engaging, in terms of making sure that stakeholders have a say, have the voice to reflected in how they're defining the blue economy. But I think I also want to make reference to our experiences, particularly when we're talking about blue assets, as Beverley had articulated quite well. But at the end of the day, I think the questions for us is who benefit from those activities, particularly in our ocean, particularly when it comes to nature resources. When we are creating a space where we bring people together to dialogue and make decisions on behalf of all of us. where our understanding of the ocean, for example, is totally different, in the sense that, if you come in with a corporate interest, you're starting to value assets in the oceans by a dollar sign. Whereas for our community, our value of our ocean is totally different. Our value of our ocean is related to us going out there and do shark calling activities. That is, in a very traditional way of merging culture and how you, bring the value of your oceans as part of your whole society. If you look into the idea of resilience, more like an insurance, how do you make sure that the ocean will continue to feed and be the source of livelihood for your coastal community, which majority of our Pacific are? In the longer term, we have seen the fisheries industry in our Pacific, for example, and that we have a high risk of non-communicable diseases because of our eating lifestyle. And then we started to question, where has our fish gone to? It's gone to Japan, it's gone to Europe, and then we are eating tin fish here in the Pacific. Where are the balance in terms of making sure that our oceans and our blue assets is really making us into a sustainable society? Then we also have a lot of reflections during the COVID in terms of our tourism industry, where a lot of our Pacific, our added value to the 5-star hotel, which majority of our Pacific don't even have that, except for the bigger country like Fiji, Vanuatu. But the smaller communal setting that has been our oceans, our ocean activities has been the attractions to bring in, tourism. And we have started to see a lot more of locally led conservations, so that it's merging, the tourists coming in, but has a much more value, adding to, the role of mangroves, the role of the whole ecosystem, connecting land to oceans, is really bring into light. But then we are also looking into the consenting. Yeah, when we are in a communal setting, where our consenting to how our blue assets should be recognized as a communal, consent. Yet we start to see that our governance system around that is up to discussions, because it should not be anymore like a decision made by one person in government. It should not be related now to a modern system where we just voted someone and then decided that that's it. We'll make decision on behalf of everyone. The consenting of our blue economy should be looked in a governance system that's more inclusive of how our society has been set up.
Thank you, Siale. And that brings me to the question around looking at women's participation, involvement, and decision-making within the blue economy agenda. In terms of women's livelihood, how do you think the blue economy impacts on women's livelihoods and lives in the Pacific and the Caribbean? Beverley, you mentioned about having mechanisms that ensure that vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, have a role, have a stake in the blue economy space, in the decisions and the gains. Could you share on your view in terms of women specifically, in terms of a group that can benefit, that is within the ocean environment, and how are they impacted by this agenda?
Sure. So traditionally, women's role in the blue economy in sectors such as fisheries and even tourism have not been well documented. As a result, it has been very much undervalued. When people start putting, as Emeline has mentioned, start putting dollar values in terms of contribution, economic contribution to sectors. And so the role of women in the blue economy is still it's still needed to be properly documented, still needed to be properly structured. Their role in the stewardship and the management of our blue assets is still not properly documented from a community standpoint, from an everyday woman standpoint. But I will tell you though, that the role of women in the blue economy is significant. It's very important. And in a country like Belize, if you look at the positions, at least 60% of key management and policy positions in government sectors and in some of the non-governmental sectors are very much occupied by women. But when you look at it, that is just a small percentage of the participation of women on a whole in the value chains and in the development activities and in the overall decision making in the blue economy. And so one of the things that we have to look at while we are developing our framework for a blue economy is to ensure that we take into consideration the targets that are set forth, like in SDG 5 and some of the other international and local planning documents that are geared towards increasing the equal rights of women to our economic resources and increasing their participation in decision making. Because even though we may have a snapshot and to say, yes, women are playing an important role in terms of drivers and probably in some leadership position, we still have not done a very good job in ensuring that we've properly integrated women in the value chains for economic development within that blue economy sector. Secondly, we believe that we need to increase the prominence that women are already playing in the blue economy. In the fisheries sector in Belize, for example, we have started that process. We've ensured that we now have a gender document which now speaks to gender in fisheries, which now speaks to women in fisheries. We have now established annual forums that actually we have an annual forum that's coined Women in Fisheries, where we bring together women that are participating in the fisheries sector at all levels, from women who are keeping the households together, to women who are at the fish market cleaning the fish, to women now who are actively engaged in the processing sector and actually in the fishing, actual going out and fishing, and to understand what their challenges are, to understand what are the realities in terms of the income gaps between women who are also playing roles that are alongside their male counterparts, and there's a certain income gap between the two genders. And also, we have now worked very hard to raise the prominence of women in actual fishing in our part of the world have always been a more male-dominated activity, where the women are mostly the home. They take care of the home, the caregivers at home, and then the men are the people who go out and actually fish. But I will tell you that we know this year, our Fisher Folk of the Year is a woman. She is a commercial lobster fisherwoman. And so it is now very much in the fisheries sector in Belize now bringing the prominence to those women who are participating in fisheries at all levels. And we now need to do that for all the sectors in the blue economy. We need to look at the tourism sector and to see how do we mirror what we've been doing in the fisheries sector. We need to work in our communities to now look at how we assess the current capacity gaps and skills of women, and to equip them with the necessary adaptive management skills that they're able to plug in along those value chain and that economic pathway that you're creating for your overall blue economy, so that you may now have women not at the top of institutions where you have like 10 to 20 women, but you would now have thousands of women participating in a blue economy sector that is contributing meaningfully to the national economy.
Thank you, Beverley, for that insight into women and fisheries and their active role in the fishery sector that contributes to the blue economy sustainable development objectives. And if I can segue in with into Siale, if Siale, in addition to fisheries, looking at women's livelihoods and impacts of blue economy, do you have, can you share any of your views in terms of the Pacific livelihoods that depend on ocean resources, and what does it mean for the blue economy, multiple sectors in all its diversity, impacting on Pacific people's livelihoods?
Thank you, Mereoni. I think I've kind of smiled to myself when I was, feeling blue, because it's interesting. But that's really what I feel like that has been, in addition to what Beverley was been sharing around. The lack of participation of women in the blue economy landscape. But at the same time, we're starting to see that as we are emerging, as we are bringing blue economy to be influencing how our national plan, how our development priorities are being defined, how our development long-term strategy. We started to see that they're taking advantage of women at the community, at the coastal areas, feeling blue, yeah, because that's really who they are. They are associated so much with our ocean. But their story is really around livelihood and resilience. Their story is about how they can use, their skills, their traditional knowledge to keep harvesting some of the, fish in the everyday living. And when you have feed your family, there is extra that you can just put it out there to gain extra money for the family. It does not really relate to how other corporate interests, because they are looking into massive extracting industry, for example. What we are concerned about is deep sea mining, for example, which is a destructive industry that is already part and parcel of the conversation around blue economy, because it fits in well to how we frame blue economy. It fits in well to how we see the economic gain that can be harvested from our blue economy to address our budget support, for example, in our national budget. But how does that translate to our community in their everyday life is really disconnected. And I think this is where we really need to look into our perspective on gender. We look into the decision making. We are still very low in terms of our representation to Parliament, where they are, in the process of making legislations, because this is where our safeguarding system is going to help us make sure that there are no bad intention that coming to harm our blue assets or our natural resources. And those spaces, political spaces, women's participation is still very low. Yeah, so I think this is where we really need to look into making sure that we don't use the participations of women in our blue economy because, in the sense of their community, that we interpret that as, yes, women are in this space and they really keen to look into. They are totally different in equal platform. That we really need to be quite careful about. And I think this is also lead to how we see data, because there's a lot of interest collecting data, collecting stories, collecting all evidence. Yeah. But then at the end of the day, how are we using those data? Is it to inform us, or is it to build further understanding by interest from corporate system to have a better understanding of using our so-called sustainable development agenda to benefit, and then we don't often find that the benefit is equally shared with our community, particularly our women. Last point, Mereoni, in terms of our women, we find in our community, you can always find our men and our young people moving. They either go to the main city urban areas or they move overseas. Women are really the one that stay at home because of their obligation, traditional obligation, looking after their elderly, looking up. And so if there is any impact, negative impact of what we are talking about, blue economy, it will really be the women that will be mostly impacted in our coastal community. And I think this is where we have to really look deeper and not just excited or inspired about the language that we have seen that is being used to kind of blue washing the whole agenda, but look deeper, read between the lines and go deeper in what does it making sense to our people in the community, particularly our Pacific. Mereoni, Pinaka.
Thank you. Thank you for those, both of you, for those strong reflections on, women's livelihoods and the impact that the blue economy can bring, both, positive as well, the benefits as well as the concerns. And then it brings me to my last questions, and if you could have your final comments in response to this question. And it really links to what's builds off what Siale has just shared about, moving, mobilizing, and building alliances, and to critically engage the blue economy agenda to ensure that the economic, the ecological, the social, as well as the gender justice aspects of sustainable development for SIDS is a priority. What if I can get both of you to share your final comments on mobilizing, a broad alliance of social actors to be engaged critically with the blue economy from our regions, including possibly maybe even a cross-regional engagement. But I leave it up to you to share your views on how we can come together.
Maybe I can start. I know okay. Beverley has been taking the lead in answering. Maybe I can start and ask Beverley to wrap up on that final questions.
Go for it.
The thing for me, Mereoni, is time and space. Yeah, I think that we had been pushed to speed up. It's like that we are in a race, like that we are racing against a timeline that has been drawn up by everyone else except us in the region. We are running against the Agenda 2030. We are running against a lot of goalposts to reach by a certain time that we should be having a clear positions. But we had been listening to the conversation. We still have capacity issue. We still have participation issue. We still have to have a good reflections of what are all the interests of our society as a whole, our young people, our marginalized groups, particularly our young people, young women, where do they see themselves in part and parcel of these conversations? And I think this is where we just need time. And I, as reflected earlier, the PIANGO Alliance comes together and said, this is just a framework, because we cannot draw any conclusion positions on what is going on with the blue economy. Just about yesterday, we were talking about green growth. Now we are talking about blue economy. Not only is confusing, but oftentimes for us to have a good dialogue in mobilizing and getting our community understand what does this whole development language that we are coming in to share with them, it takes time. And I think this is where we're saying it's a framework, it's a living document. It can change. We can now, if we are to look at it now with the context of COVID, I am sure that we will come up with something that we had not thought about before, because the timing and the context changes. And I think this is where I would like to say, give our Pacific people time to digest, to understand, live and face the challenges of their livelihood, and they would say, oh, okay, this is what does it mean by blue economy, yeah? And how do we engage in that space? And I think this is where I think that networking, like what we are doing now with Beverley and others from particularly our friends from that has from SITS that has a kind of a similar setting, coastal, isolated in terms of our oceans. We have a lot to learn from each other. But there are common things that we can, wherever we are, is the involvement of our women to be recognized in how we develop our plan, any sustainable development to the future, because they are the core of raising our family. And we just need to make sure that how they run their community, how they run their family should be translated to how they should be engaged at the political level. So that we don't have to ask for temporary special measures. It should be just like, yeah, we value the contribution of women. Let's bring them in and be part of that. Vinaka.
Thank you, Siale. Over to you, Beverley, for your final comments.
Well said, Siale, that I totally identify with your comment that it should not be extraordinary measures that we're looking at to ensure that women are properly mainstreamed and included in a blue economy. But the reality is that there's much work to be done. And we need to get there. I think the important thing is that we need to get there. And from my perspective is that while I very much appreciate that we need time, we need to ensure that we have a framework in place which has adequately treated the issue of women, gender, and in general, our society on a whole, our marginal and our vulnerable groups. We need to truly employ a people-centered approach to blue economic development. There are a lot of buzz words and principles going around, but I tend to like to identify with one that has been going around, which speaks to blue justice. And it's about having a people-centered approach, and a people-centered approach where you're promoting the interests of the ordinary person, of the small-scale fisheries worker, of the vulnerable and the marginalized communities, with an eye towards the imbalances in power which exist, and the imbalances which exist with equity and access and participation and rights within the blue economy, so that we may now look at opportunities to now close those gaps, to close those inequality gaps. And I think for us is that the excitement is that there is now an approach to look at blue economy from a holistic standpoint, and not just from a sectorial standpoint and an ad hoc standpoint. And there is the opportunity for us to now look at how we could have those systems in place to mainstream these issues that are in our face when it comes to the participation of women and other vulnerable groups in the blue economy, so that we could come back, Siale, and indeed look forward to the day when we're not looking at having to pen and articulate an extraordinary measure which speaks to the participation of these groups, and to be very much satisfied that women are on a level playing field as it relates to their participation, their access to the resources, and them benefiting from our blue assets at the end of the day. And so for us, that is really the excitement for us, because we now have an opportunity. How we strengthen our frameworks is exactly through this. It was so wonderful speaking to having this dialogue with Siale, who is, as we were mentioning earlier, she's in the future. She's in a different time zone that we are, but the reactions, the observations, the experiences are very much valuable. And I think, to answer your question, Mereoni, is that we need to create the space for this kind of exchange. We need to create a platform for this kind of exchange at all levels, at the youth level and at the other levels, so that we could now build on our experiences, understand what the challenges we have as regions and as peoples, and to see what have been our approach in order for us to see how we could strengthen our framework. We have the opportunity to do that, and I think we need to mobilize at a regional level and at an international level through SIDS, our SIDS platform, through our AOSIS platforms, but also on a bilateral level between countries, and also even internally within our own countries, to even look at your various regions within your own country, and to see how we could build on the experiences that women are having in terms of their participation in the blue economy. And so I think that is the kind of mobilization that we would want to see, so that we could move toward that ideal that my very good colleague Siale is envisioning, and that's a good vision to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverley, and thank you both to Siale and Beverley for those final comments. And Beverley, if I can just take something that really stood out that you just shared about involvement and so forth in your final comments around blue justice, which just, when you said that, really just popped out at me and really touched me in terms of what you two have both shared about, the call to action, the involvement, working together and collaborating to get more involvement in the blue economy, to engage it in strategic and meaningful and critical ways, as both of you have shared. So thank you for this, for sharing your views. Thank you very much.